UNLV Microcertificate Economics. Okie dokie! We want to talk about the markets for the factors of production. Remember that there are 4 of them. There's labor. There's land. There's capital. And there are entrepreneurs. So mostly now we want to talk about land in this part, and then the next part we'll talk about the other 3. But, generically speaking, the demand for factors of production is what we call a derived demand. Starbucks doesn't hire workers because they like people and they want to have workers. They hire workers because somebody needs to make beverages and somebody needs to run the cash register and somebody, right? So the number of workers they hire is a function of how much demand there is for their product. And if you go into my neighborhood Starbuckses on Saturday morning, the whole city of Henderson seems like it's in there, and they have 10 people working. And then you go in on a Tuesday afternoon, and there's 3 people working. Right? The number of people that they have working is there based on the amount of demand there is for beverages. Okay? It's a derived demand. Now, we talk in economics about something called marginal revenue product. The marginal revenue product is the additional amount of money I get from hiring a worker. So, in my younger days, I actually worked at Burger King. And they discovered that I was so fast and efficient. Part of my job was to get there in the middle of the night, sort of, when it was still dark, and put everything together, put the broiler together, and stock the shelves, and mop the floor, and I was so good at it that they could open an hour earlier on the days I worked than on the days I didn't work. Well, that makes me extremely productive because they make more money on the days that I work. So I have a really high marginal revenue product, and they gave me a whopping 5% raise because of it, which is what you're supposed to do. This is my MRP, my marginal revenue product. I was bringing in essentially more money than the other workers because I let them open the store early. So I should have gotten paid more than the other workers, which I did. You should get paid based on your marginal revenue product, your MRP. So if we just look at one business, we look at this Burger King, the demand for labor depends on their MRP, the individual output. How much does each worker produce in money terms? What's my value to the firm? The price of other things. So if I can replace you with the machine, and that machine doesn't cost millions and millions of dollars, I'll probably replace you with that machine, right? So the price of land and capital has an effect on what the demand for labor is. And related to that, of course, is technology. If we invent new technology, that'll change. So the company's demand for labor increases, the demand for my good increases, right? It's a derived demand. It raises my MRP. We're selling more. I'm producing more money for the firm, so I should get paid more. Adam Smith argued that college professors should get paid based on how many students they can attract. And the good professors should get paid more because they can attract more studenti. Okay? Now some pieces of this that we need to know, particularly here about labor supply, because, well, if we're looking at the world right now, the problem isn't labor demand. There's lots of it. The problem is labor supply, which is that there's not enough of it in some businesses, in some places. Okay? Part of this problem is what we call the reservation wage. The reservation wage is the minimum wage, the smallest wage you are willing to accept to take a job. And as people have pointed out, if you're advertising a $30 an hour job, there is not a labor shortage. There are tons of people lining up to work for you. If you're advertising a $40 an hour job, there are tons of people lining up to work for you. If you're advertising a $12 an hour job, you're going to have that help wanted sign in your window all the time, because even after you hire people, they're going to start like the next week looking for another job that pays better. Reservation wage. What's the smallest wage I will take? And it seems like during the pandemic that people's reservation wages went up. That they're expecting higher pay, that they're perfectly willing to do a couple of side gigs instead of having a regular job if the pay in that regular job is too low. And it's changed the way people hunt for jobs, right? Clearly there's been some change in that reservation wage, including benefits, right? People want benefits in jobs that didn't normally have benefits before, and benefits become more important. It also may turn out that this labor supply curve is what we call backward bending. And what that means is, and there's a reason I put a taxi cab up here. There was a study of taxi cab drivers. And the taxi cab companies thought something was very peculiar. On the days when there were big conventions in town, it seemed like they couldn't get cabs, that people would be hanging out and there wouldn't be cabs and there wouldn't be cabs. And on days when there was no customers, when there was nothing going on in town, there'd be a ton of cabs all over the road. And the cab company said, you know, this is hurting our profits. This is the opposite of what we want to happen. Why does it happen? Well, the answer turns out to be simple, that most cab drivers wanted to make a certain amount of money. So if they set out in the morning and go, hey, I'm going to make $200, that's my goal for the day. Once they make $200, headed home. No reason to keep driving. On days when there's a lot of customers, it's easy to make their money, and they were all going home early. On days when there weren't any customers out there, it was hard to make their money, and they all stayed out and worked a long time. So that's what we would call a backward bending supply of labor, that actually at some point, if their wages go up above a certain point, they lessen their work. Labor supply is a complicated thing, right? We are human beings. We're not normal. Or we are normal, but we're normal in our own ways. And so the company has to do other things to provide incentives so that workers keep working on the days you want them to work. And related to all this, and certainly related to our labor shortage right now, is what we call the non-pecuniary aspects of the job. Burger King. I had to get up in the ceiling and clean out hot grease traps. I had to do all sorts of disgusting things. And they came to me and they went, hey, why don't you drop out of college and become the assistant manager and one day you'll be... No. Be a college professor or clean grease traps for the rest of my life. No. Okay? There are jobs that are not nice jobs. And those jobs should pay more. The worse the job is, the more you should get paid. But that's not always the case. Okay? People during the pandemic became more and more concerned about these non-pecuniary aspects. There are studies going on right now that show that work from home jobs and have to go in-person jobs that are the same job, the work from home job is getting like 7 times as many applicants. People have changed what they expect. They want more. They want a better life out of their job, essentially. We have ongoing conflict at UNLV because we have lots of professors who enjoyed the freedom that they got from teaching online. And the university wants them to go back and teach in person, even though we did surveys of the students. And the students, seems like the students, for their first couple years, want that to be online. And some of the stuff in their later years, they want to be that online. But we're going to force them to go back in the classroom, and we're forcing the faculty to go back in the classroom. Not me, the bosses. Okay? And maybe they haven't figured out that the world has changed. The bosses need to look at the new world and decide what that new world is and talk to their customers, the students, right, about that, and talk to their employees about that. Schools that are more flexible with their professors are going to find it's easier to hire new professors and to keep their existing professors, right? We get asked that question by professors coming in, teaching online versus not teaching online, and how flexible are we? Okay? It's interesting. It's fascinating. All right. So let's talk about unions for a few minutes. One of the problems with businesses is that when you have big businesses, those big businesses have more power than each individual worker does. My mom grew up in a little town in the Midwest, and there was one factory in that town. And everybody in town almost worked for that factory. Her father was lucky. He worked for the power company. He had a much better job than the people who worked for the factory. How do the workers deal with that? You get a job at the factory, you don't have a job, it's pretty hard for those workers to negotiate individually when there's 10 other guys who will take their job. Okay? So, some things about unions. They come in different types. There are what we call craft or trade unions. Those are unions like the plumbers union and the carpenters union. Unions where everybody in that union has a skill. Historically, those unions have been very important because that's how people got trained in those skills. You got trained as a plumber by joining the plumbers union. You got trained as a carpenter by working in the carpenters union. And because those unions could restrict, just like a monopoly restricts the supply of the good, the craft union can restrict the supply of plumbers. And if you restrict the supply of plumbers, you raise the value of the plumber, and the plumbers are going to get paid more. Okay? Simple. We have industrial unions. Those are like the United Auto Workers, the United Mine Workers. Doesn't matter what your skill is, you work for this industry, you can belong to this union. And that means, and we'll talk about this more, but that means that the unions can negotiate together with the company. Both those kind of unions in the United States are shrinking. The one kind of union that's expanding in the United States is what we call public employee unions. Those are unions of people who work for the government. We don't actually have those in Nevada. We have something like that, sort of. But I went to California for a year to help them start a new university, and everybody in California belongs to a union. All of the university employees there are unionized. Even the graduate students are unionized in California. Okay? We also have things called associations, which are kind of like unions, like the American Medical Association. And again, what does the American Medical Association do? And we'll talk about this more in a later lecture, but they're going to try to restrict the number of doctors, at least the number of people who can do things like write a prescription. And in doing that, they raise their wages. Okay? The key thing to remember about unions is unions let us engage in collective bargaining. Unions have had a dramatic positive effect on wages in this country over time. Now, lots of people are anti-union nowadays, and strangely enough, the middle class kind of working people in the United States tend to be the most anti-union, and they're the ones that have benefited most from the existence of unions. The unskilled, low-skilled workers have by far benefited the most from unions being around. Collective bargaining means everybody gets bargained for together. So actually in our state, collective bargaining for government employees is legal, sort of. And so, for example, CSN, the community college, they have a collective bargaining unit. And so they elect 5 people, the professors do, and those 5 people negotiate their contract for them. And the school teachers have a collective bargaining group, and they go negotiate terms with the school district. Okay, it's not really a union, but they can still practice a collective bargaining, which is very importante. We have a related word to all this, and that related word is monopsony. Monopsony means one buyer. So just like a monopoly is the only one that sells something, a monopsony is the only one that buys something. In my mom's town where she was growing up, that factory was pretty much a monopsony. They controlled most of the labor market. Are they going to pay high wages? No, they're going to pay lower wages because they know you don't have any option. Just like monopolies manage to raise the price, monopsonies are going to manage to lower the wages that get paid. All right? Now, but you form a union. right? So now you have a monopsony against a monopoly. It's called bilateral monopoly. And now the two of them can fight it out. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. As I'm doing this, baseball is negotiating with their union. Major League Baseball is negotiating with their union. And it's not going too well, right? The two sides, you've got billionaires versus millionaires, and neither side wants to give, and their sport has issues, right? Young people are not that fascinated with going to a 4-hour-long baseball game. Baseball games used to last 2 hours in Babe Ruth's day, and so they need to do things to fix their game, to attract the younger crowd, to go, and instead they're fighting, and that's often what happens, right? Somewhat to be expected, but this is the way the world works, unfortunately.